Hi, my name is Steve Stein. I'm the founder of Better Listen and our new community, Wisdom Feed Plus. And we're very, very honored to have our friend John Kabat Zinn kind of putting in his, sharing his wisdom on this month's subject. The topic of this is light within the darkness. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Steve. It's really nice to be here and to be with your folks.
Awesome having you. Awesome having you. So just as a little context, we started this new online community, Wisdom Feed Plus, a few months ago, and we have kind of like wise guides or guest lecturers, or those kinds of things. And we have a different theme each month. And I've found it personally really rewarding and interesting to having a Qigong teacher talking about gratitude and a yoga teacher and a psychologist talking about the same subject, but coming at it from different angles. Interesting content that we've created, and can't imagine anyone else, anyone better than our dear friend John to give us his input on this subject, especially as it's been a long winter in a lot of ways, and spring is here. And so John, it's light within the darkness. What do you mean by that, light within the darkness?
Well, first of all, it's nice to be here with you, Steve, and with everybody who's tuning in or going to tune in at some point. So we're doing this on March 21st, I think. So it's the day after the spring equinox. So fitting that we're doing it today, because even when we look at the seasons, we go from periods of relative light to relative darkness, again, depending on where you are on the planet, distance north or south from the equator. But at this particular moment, when Ukraine has experienced now 4 weeks of utter devastation and destruction, gratuitously invaded by another country that's just completely disregarded its sovereignty and broken all the rules of that have come to basically feature the time since the end of World War II or the Korean War, that this invasion is an absolute travesty. And the fact is, now we can see it on all our devices in real time, 24/7, and in some sense experience or take in, or not be able to take in, the magnitude of the death and destruction, the suffering, the huge outflow of refugees from the country, which are almost entirely mothers and young children and babies. And imagine the trauma of this. I mean, leaving your husbands, often leaving the elderly. Sometimes the elderly are coming, but your entire life has been bombed to smithereens, whether your house is still standing or not. So this almost defines darkness. It defines a certain kind of shadow that feels a lot like an archetype of, just evil, no concern whatsoever for indiscriminately bombing civilian populations for no reason, and coming really out of the mind of one person who happens to also control nuclear weapons. So we're talking about darkness on a lot of different levels. And the trauma of it all can lead to depression and despair on the part of the bystanders. And this is the fact that we are bystanders itself is a certain kind of horror, because we are feeling potentially impotent, not able to meet the moment at the level that it really requires, with compassion, with help, with putting our shoulder to the wheel, with receiving refugees or whatever because of distance or culture or whatever. So almost overnight, starting on February 24th, we've experienced a kind of quantum leap in the amount of darkness and even evil, a word that I don't like to use very much. But in terms of this, it really feels way beyond greed, hatred, and delusion of the ordinary kind. It really feels like evil to be able to commit murder and mass trauma on the kind of scale that's being done, and with all the deceit associated with it, so that the entire country of Russia is basically being kept in the dark and being fed a counter narrative that has the Ukrainians as the aggressors and as seriously problematic to the well-being of the Russian nation, and all of this stuff. And of course, we're no strangers to counter narratives, counterfactual narratives now in the United States. I mean, they've been going on forever, but again, amplified by television and now social media in all the ways that it has been, and then also by our own past president, who's a genius at amplification and at creating his own reality, but that has an infectious quality that seems to really target a large fraction of our own population. We are living in a time of potentially enormous darkness and danger, because this is all transpiring in minds that have access to nuclear weapons and unimaginable levels of destruction. Still, at this point, the only country that's actually ever used nuclear weapons is the United States, that dropped them on two cities. So nobody gets off scot-free. And we also have invaded countries where we thought our interests, were at stake without any, real reflection of, that sovereignty demands that we not do that. But if we have the right rationale, so how can we criticize Putin? So the darkness, in some sense, is something that's really profound, and it's everywhere, including in some sense in our own hearts. And this is the kind of, what some people call the banality of evil, that you can get used to it, that you see it every day in your newspapers or on your screens, and it becomes a steady diet of a certain kind of degrading of our empathic consciousness, our ability to actually recognize the light inside the darkness, the potential beauty of human beings, and compassion, and the enormity of the reception of these 10 million refugees flooding out of Ukraine at the moment and into Poland and Hungary and Romania and so forth, and then down the road, perhaps all over the world. Although at the moment, the Ukrainian refugees are hopeful that the war will end and they'll soon be able to go back and rebuild. But the future is really opaque. We just don't know even how much more destruction and how containable it is, even in Ukraine, never mind the rest of the world. So we're at one of these moments where if we didn't feel challenged and concerned by the enormity of the dangers of global warming, for instance, for our future generations, and even for people who unfortunately happen to live in low-lying areas around the globe that are experiencing, floods and monsoons, or at the opposite end of the spectrum, droughts and desertification. We had enough problems on our plate as a human species on planet Earth before February 24th. And yet, here we go, the unimaginable, that you don't invade other countries. One person felt it justified to do it and doesn't seem to likely to be backing off anytime soon. So it's a conundrum for the entire planet. And this is where mindfulness really becomes incredibly important. Because mindfulness is really, in some sense, the one superpower that human beings all have access to and that we haven't actually realized in our everyday lives. And that's why often the word realization is associated with the word meditation, that what is it that needs to be realized? And what would that even mean, to realize the enormity of the suffering and the root cause of the suffering, which is really the human mind when it doesn't know itself and is in some sense subject to the illness or disease of greed, hatred, and delusion. In some cases, writ unimaginably large, but who among us doesn't actually suffer or have our lives be in some sense influenced almost moment by moment by what we want or what we fear or who we dislike or who we like, and what we, the amount of negativity we often feel for ourselves. And so this is the mind when it doesn't have access to this deep capacity for awareness that would allow us to, in some sense, balance it out and discover or uncover or recover what the title of this talk or conversation is about. And that is that there is always some light, we might call it, even within the banality of the darkness and of the destruction, harm, hatred. And this is also a very major thread of human history. But I think the curriculum of the moment for the human species on planet Earth is for us to actually amplify our capacity for learning, growing, healing, and transformation in our own individual lives and as societies on this planet while there's still time.
Wow, that's pretty profound kind of overview of where we are. Now, you mentioned mindfulness becomes super important, and then in the next breath, you talked about realization of the enormity of what's happening. But what about, it struck me that it makes it real, like get real. It's also, if I look, my mind goes to the pictures I remember of World War II. They were in black and white, but similar scenes. Yeah. Devastating. But I think that a lot of times those were newsreels, and that was before my time, but they became in the Saturday morning, in the movies, they would show newsreels of the war, and like curated by every Department of Defense. And like, I don't know if it's sanitized, but
they were propaganda films in their own right.
Exactly. So this is, raw and real in real time. And
sanitized.
And we're it's not sanitized. And
well, we don't know. It probably is sanitized, I'm guessing, because but some stuff they're just not going to show on television.
I saw a newscast where whoever it was, and it's like, oh my God, there's a body there, warning this, because he's in real time. So
they're giving warnings about it and definitely showing a lot.
But I'm saying you said realization, but it's in real time. It's like there's no like 6 months later. So we can't claim that we don't know about it or
Exactly.
look the other way.
Yeah, exactly.
And then by meditating on it, maybe there's finding some humanity in it, or some, like me, I'm an optimist, but how do we find some optimism or some light within this darkness? And mindfulness, and how does that help it make it more real or simple?
Well, it's very easy to misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying get all passive and go into some kind of meditative state where you tune this out, or where you amplify it so much in your thinking mind and your emotions that you can't sleep and you drive yourself insane. Of course, just watching the stuff, we can't sleep and we're being driven insane because of the witnessing the horror of it. And it brings out our natural compassion. And compassion is a verb. It means the instinct to actually step in and be of some use. And then if you feel like I'm too far away, or I don't have the tools to be of some real use, then you might feel real impotence or disappointment or frustration, and a lot of stress and even trauma from that secondary kind of to the, but that's exactly what I'm talking about, is to be able to hold it in a way that doesn't get caught in the mind's own inflamed reactivity, because that's no wiser than tuning it out completely and saying, well, it doesn't concern me, we're safe over here. And this has happened forever, and all of us are basically immigrants, or sort of the product of earlier immigration in our family. And most of that immigration to the United States has been because of wars and devastation and every imaginable kind of Holocaust. Going back, to the very founding of the people, and and then slavery, a Holocaust of its own, where people were enslaved and brought from Africa to work in our fields, because the white people, couldn't figure out how to work in the fields themselves, or didn't want to, or whatever.
One of the things that I'm just thinking about is you look at not only Zelensky, all the, the people are staying there to fight for their turf. I mean, I'm from Brooklyn. Like I used to say that, I was young, but we were anti-Vietnam War, and basically in my family. But I said, if they came to Brighton Beach, if they showed up on my turf, I would, there's no chance they would survive. Now, I say that kind of off the cuff, but this is really happening. So I'm wondering, I'm just thinking of the Buddhist idea of not being fearless or fearlessness, or I'm not sure if it's Buddhist, but it's a sentiment that I doubt Zelensky and these people are not necessarily Buddhist, but they are just exhibiting fearlessness, or I'm sure they're plenty scared, but they're embodying, I don't know what the right terminology, but.
Well, this is part of the light that we're referring to, is we are watching human beings rise to the occasion and refuse to be bullied. Because this is a case of, blatant bullying, as much as it is anything else, except the bullying is raining down unimaginable destruction on the civilian population and all these, sort of structures within a country that are important for the actual, history of the country to sort of be embodied. And the Russian army has a kind of, sort of war plan of just laying waste to cities, whether it was in Chechnya, in the second war in Chechnya, just total lay waste, because it's too costly for their army to go in and do house to house, combat and stuff like that. And the same in Syria. I mean, and no one batted an eye for the most part. I mean, just broadly speaking, when it was happening in Chechnya or when it was happening in Syria. You didn't get a kind of outpouring of absolute indignation and saying, stop, this has to stop, the way it's happening in Ukraine. And part of that is, of course,
They're people like
racism.
us. They're
It's
people like
racism.
us.
You know, yeah, they look like us. They look like some of us.
And right. And I feel, I don't know about guilty, but I know of the other, tragedies that occurred, but I'm not intimately familiar with it. And
Well, exactly. But this is where, again, mindfulness comes in, that we have to recognize, going back to the verb, to recognize that even in our concern and desire to be of use and to help in some sense to alleviate the horrors and the suffering going on right in this moment, that our ignorance has prevented us from actually doing that in all sorts of other places on the planet, that people are experiencing their own nightmare levels of harm. And we don't recognize it at all. Even if our eyes read over it in the newspaper, it's in one ear and out the other, or we don't even read the article. We just get the headline because we'd like tune out whatever it is, if it's a different country on a different continent. So awareness actually is a really powerful counterforce, because it wakes us up to our own internal contradictions that actually cause us to fall into mental traps where we can be compassionate some of the time, but we're not broadly or universally compassionate, even though everybody basically is the same human being. And this is a disease. This is a kind of a virus of its own, that lack of awareness of our common humanity on a planet where right now, having given it a fever by virtue of the industrialized world's industry over the past 200 to 300 years, but everybody's experiencing the fever, even if you didn't have an industrial society until, recent times. And so we have to develop a new way of understanding who we are as human beings. And that's really where mindfulness comes in, because it's saying, before we get into acting or doing or finding what the right solution is, we have to actually tune the mind, just like you would tune a violin before playing in an orchestra. You don't play the violin just because you're a good violinist and you got a great instrument. You have to actually tune it. And you have to continually make sure it stays in tune. And part of that tuning is tuning to our own wisdom and compassion, which is intrinsic to us as human beings, but usually gets eclipsed by what we were talking about earlier, the greed, hatred, and delusion that's not just in Putin, but it's in all of us. And yet, also in all of us is that beauty that we're seeing among the Ukrainians at the moment, to say, no, we are not going to just let this happen to our people and to our country, that we have to take a stand. So that's exactly what meditation is. It's taking a stand at first by taking a seat.
By sitting in right.
But you have to understand that, or when you take a seat, you'll take your seat hoping for some special state to come along, some special privileged meditative state where all of a sudden everything will become clear and you'll be your most compassionate self and your most wise self, and you'll never have any concerns about being caught in greed, hatred, and delusion. Of course, that's like a fiction. But awareness itself already is not caught in greed, hatred, and delusion. For the brief moments that we could actually inhabit our own awareness. And then, so how does that help Ukraine? It doesn't until you let your doing, what you will actually do, engage in how you will act, come out of that full dimensionality of being. That's not privileging us versus them in any way, but recognizing how how, sources of bullying, do in fact make differentiate between the oppressor and the oppressed. And what we can do is, with wisdom and compassion, actually extend ourselves to whatever degree possible to help those who are being oppressed, and to protest the violence and the horror of the system that allows that kind of aggression to be promulgated. And the Russians are doing that big time at the moment. The Russian people are doing that, even under the threat of unbelievable prison terms and violence and everything else. You hold up a sign with nothing on it, just a blank piece of paper, and you can get grabbed by 3 cops and beaten on the street with batons and hauled off and put in jail.
And not just a couple of weeks.
People are continuing to hold up those signs, and a lot clearer signs, like on the woman who did that in the television program and said "No war" right behind the newscaster. This is a level of bravery and selflessness that arises in all of us when we see the size of the cloth, the level of injustice that's being perpetrated.
What'd you say, the size of the cloth?
The size of the cloth.
What does that mean?
The enormity of the human condition that a war like this of aggression, a wanton war of aggression like this brings forth. That line, you see the size of the cloth, comes from a poem by a woman named Naomi Shihab Nye, who's a Palestinian American. So of course, the Palestinians have known plenty of this kind of suffering for decades and decades and decades, as have so many other indigenous peoples all around the world. So this is, just one more example of the human condition facing itself, and in some sense calling us to wake up and thread the needle in a way that, on the one hand, doesn't create nuclear Armageddon for all of us, and on the other hand, doesn't succumb to this kind of aggression, because succumbing to this kind of aggression or letting it pass actually just feeds the aggression. It's not going to end at Ukraine by any stretch of the imagination. And so there are all sorts of interesting things going on here, because, the mindfulness tradition, for instance, is only like 50 or 60 years old in the West, in the kind of formulation of it that is related to mindfulness-based stress reduction and other mindfulness-based interventions, and the whole science of mindfulness, which is very, very recent, maybe only 20 or 30 years old at the most. Okay, but in China, what we're talking about right now is over 1,500 years old. Some of the greatest articulations of this wisdom teaching, this dharma of mindfulness, so to speak, comes out of the Chinese Chan tradition. And imagine if somebody had the capacity to get close to Xi Jinping at the moment and remind him that what he does in the next week or two will make a difference for centuries, and that there are ancient Chinese traditions that are more powerful and more in alignment with the deep universal wisdom than really almost any other country has. He's sitting on top of that kind of a resource. Imagine if he actually woke up to it. Of course.
Well, I think my guess is he probably understands how powerful it is, which is why he's not bringing it up.
I don't know if he knows or not, but they do know in China. And they have a very interesting way. Now, of course, in many ways, their society is more repressive than Russian society, with the great firewall of China and what you can't say and everything else. But I'm talking like beyond the context of right now. We need a kind of orthogonal moment, and we can all undergo those kinds of orthogonal moments. But I don't want to give up on Xi Jinping actually, perhaps, taking a look at Putin and saying, I don't want to be there. And I could very easily wind up there with my friend Putin and Stalin and Hitler and all those other dictators and aggressors who ultimately wind up losing, because there's a kind of natural law. You might call it the Tao. The Chinese would call it the Tao. There's a natural lawfulness that if you nurture this kind of evil and destruction, it comes right back to you in ways that the human mind is not smart enough to actually forecast or prognosticate. But these ancient wisdom practices have been around long enough to realize that it is cyclical and there are lessons to be learned. So I'm not saying that's going to happen, but what I'm saying is then there's everybody on the planet who's already practicing mindfulness. And so there's the potential here. It's a low probability event, but a very high impact if it were to happen, that as a species, we would wake up right now and say, time out. This game is just, we have to call the game because it is intolerable for all involved. All involved. The Russian soldiers that weren't even told that they were going to war and invading a country that's not their own, and where they speak Russian, and the grandmas in the Ukraine are berating these 20-something Russian soldiers and saying, what the hell are you doing here? And they don't have a good answer. And apparently they're being fed until they ran out of food, ready-made meals, that are with an expired expiration date, years expired. So, there's a lot of craziness here, and I want to leave room for the orthogonal beauty to arise, that which is not really thinkable with thought, but that very often happens when we somehow rotate in consciousness and all of a sudden see things that we just were incapable of seeing a moment before. An opening, a possibility, an act of compassion, an act of connection that actually spreads, not just by social media, but because its impact is so powerful to say, yes, I want to be on that side of humanity. And it turns out all of humanity can be on the side of humanity. There's no other side. There's only us. And the sun and the other planets in our solar system are not going to care one bit whether we blow ourselves up or not, but we should for the sake of the grandchildren and future generations.
If there's any light in the darkness, it is majority of, at least in our country, are people realizing we are on the same side, which on February 23rd, you couldn't even imagine what would make that happen.
Continues. Let's hope that continues. I don't want to be too la and pie in the sky about all this.
Right.
One of the things that impresses me, not so much about this country at the moment, we'll see, but so far I think Biden is threading a very, very challenging needle. And of course, what Putin's done has galvanized the European countries and NATO in a way that, they were about to dissolve. And Trump was basically, sort of trying to catalyze that, whether for, Putin's sake or for, his whatever. But there's really the possibility that the Europeans, having brought all these people in like this, I mean, it's a gigantic act of human compassion, but it's actually going to be also an enormous challenge for their economies, for housing, for everything else, on a colossal scale. And there's so much compassion pouring out and so much wisdom and so much money being brought to bear that, it is possible that it will, wind up catalyzing what I call an orthogonal rotation in consciousness that will actually wake up to the fact that, you know, our own small little lives with our own small little property and, you know, protection and everything else, it's actually very, very delicately balanced. And that our biggest strength is in compassion. Our biggest strength is in mindful awareness. Mindfulness, by the way, just to point it out to people who might not know and think that mindfulness and compassion are different. Mindfulness is pure awareness. And the word for mind in Chinese and almost every other Asian language, the word for mind and the word for heart, interestingly enough, and this is one of the most powerful things about these Asian cultures, their word for mind and word for heart is the same word. So if you hear the word mindfulness and you're not hearing heartfulness, you're not really understanding what's being talked about or pointed to. And you already have it. It's every single person already has it. It's a human birthright, because it's not like we have to acquire awareness. We're born with awareness. The trouble is that we've never got any training in how to access it. So because we're such powerful thinkers and so caught up in our emotions, in liking and disliking, that we get that the awareness kind of gets clouded over and we get lost in thought and in emotional reactivity, whether it's the good guys versus the bad guys or whatever it is, _lost. We're still lost. And what I'm talking about really involves recognizing that when we pop that bubble of attachment to thought and emotion, just like a soap bubble, all of a sudden you're free to see things as they are. And your awareness already does. We know instantly, for instance, when a harm is being done. We may ignore it, or we may get scared in the face of it, but we know it. And that's the beauty of when people rise to the occasion. When they rise to the occasion in the face of evil, in the face of harm, in the face of suffering, that is our innate compassion and our innate wakefulness, awareness, mindfulness, motivating us to actually step in and do what we can. Okay, and that's what I mean when I talk about our doing coming out of being. And we don't have to save the world, but if there's some way that we could like make the tiniest little contribution, and billions of people making the tiniest little contribution, and sometimes it's just saying no, and sometimes it may be leaving Russia, as hundreds of thousands of people apparently are doing in the, you know, if they can get out on Turkish Airlines or whatever, because they don't want to be part of this charade anymore, and it's like too much of a cost, too much suffering. And everybody on the planet has to, in some sense, I mean, the invitation here would be, what is your karmic assignment? What in the face of what's happening on March 21st? What is yours to do? What little thing could you do that you're being drawn to do, that your intuition is offering to do, that would actually be of some use, that would mitigate a tiny little bit of the suffering, that would extend itself in one way or another, whether it's with money or with Airbnb or with housing or you know, whatever,
Or
to
it's something
actually
that,
err on the side of aggressing less and being of use a little bit more. And to do that as a support for the people in Ukraine who are going to go down with the ship or prevail. And hopefully they will prevail, but they are not going to leave. It's obvious. And that itself, as you were pointing out, Steve, is an enormous kind of object lesson for the rest of us, that, you know, there are things worse than death. There's the death of your integrity, the death of your ethics, the death of your love. And when we see integrity and ethics and love and determination and all of those things saying no to this invasion, no matter how horrible the missiles and the supersonic weapons and everything else, and the threat of more and more and more from the sea, from the air, from the land. And he's saying, no, we're standing firm. That inspires everybody, as you were saying earlier, to actually recognize that what's deepest and best in us human beings so eclipses fear and hatred and ignorance and delusion that it's surpassingly inspirational, inspiring. And so we're at that kind of a moment. We didn't need it. We have global warming, we have racism, we have, you know, unbelievable social injustice baked into our laws, and in
Pandemics,
so
all
many
kinds.
ways we had plenty of work to do, and now we have this on top of that, with the threat, if we don't thread the needle correctly, the unthinkable may happen. So we need wisdom now. I mean, just like with COVID, we need all hands on deck on Spaceship Earth to actually embody what's deepest and best in us human beings, and really write new sets of laws that outlaw and have severe punishments for too much accumulation of the kind of power that autocrats are wielding, whether it's in the form of money, or whether it's in the form of nuclear weapons, or whether it's in the form of, you know, sort of autocracy of any kind. That we need to create laws that actually cultivate well-being, equilibrium, compassion, clarity, kindness, well-being for everybody on the planet, as since every person on the planet is one of the cells of the body politic, if you will, of the entire planet. And if some cells are not doing well, then you have cancer or you have some kind of wasting disease. We can't do that to any human being on the planet, or to Mother Nature for that matter. So this requires wakefulness on levels that we have not risen to at the level of societies, never mind nations, never mind collectively. But this is a moment where I could see that happening with the Chinese and the Russians. Mindfulness is very, very popular in China now. Never mind Xi Jinping, but mindfulness is extremely popular throughout China now. And its greatest popularity is among people who are like on the average 25 years old. So they're the future of China. It's also popular in Russia. I mean, there are all sorts of things that unite us. And I think the light inside the darkness, so to speak, is this potential that we have to actually thread this needle into a present moment, which we would call the future. But if we thread the needle in this moment, and then this moment, and this moment, and this moment, through cultivating mindfulness, not just on a meditation cushion, but at the UN and, you know, in everywhere on the planet, you know, in NATO, where, and all of these institutions have been or are being influenced in some sense, or are looking into mindfulness in one way or another. This is that kind of a moment. And it's not about like follow one teacher or whoever you think the greatest exponent of mindfulness is. No, you're the one teacher. You're the one to follow yourself. Follow your heart. Follow what is deepest and best and most beautiful in yourself, and trust those instincts, even if the thinking mind is making calculations about, well, how is this going to serve me, or how is this going to inconvenience me, or what will happen to my this, that, or the other. And realize that, like, there's a new way of being potentially, where we can all, in some sense, benefit and maximize well-being, minimize harm, and live in a way that opens to our true humanity.
Wow. Yeah.
How to
Yeah.
do it, you know, is anybody's guess. I mean, you know, so that's the beauty of it, is that let's say everybody's a genius. In MBSR, we see every person who walks into the room with any kind of medical diagnosis whatsoever, we see them as basically a miraculous being, a genius. Well, so that's everybody on the planet. So if everybody actually, in some sense, gets in touch with their own miraculous being, it doesn't take much to wake up to sort of trusting what you always wanted to do in life yourself anyway, but then maybe circumstances made it more difficult. But there are, until you stop breathing, you're ahead of the curve. So this moment is the moment to actually start inhabiting and relating to whatever the circumstances of this moment are calling forth, and then trusting your own instincts. Yes, we can all be teachers for each other, and we can listen to podcasts and watch this and that on YouTube or whatever, but ultimately this instrument, so to speak, needs to tune itself and then be in resonance with all the instruments that you feel most in tune with, and then trust in that emergence and do whatever the hell makes the most sense at this particular moment in time.
And, you know, it seems almost like, you know, it's counterintuitive. Well, by doing nothing, I have the best chance of doing something.
Yeah, although I would correct the language.
I wouldn't use that language.
You know, I would tweak that because, well, just to be clear, I make a distinction between non-doing, which sounds very Chinese, right? You know, Asian, and doing nothing. So doing nothing, like we know what that is, that's like, you know, being inert. Non-doing is being fully awake and understanding that, you know, and all good leaders know this, that they hardly have to do anything and everything good flows out of it, as long as their mind is clear, so they don't do all this bad stuff or this destructive stuff or this unwise stuff that then just creates more and more problems. And part of that doing then is just what I was saying, infectiously, just like a meme, just like COVID, only just purely positive virus, infectious kind of spread of affirming our beauty as human beings, and that we will not tolerate the kind of destruction that we're seeing, not just in Ukraine, but in all places where autocracy is ruling and people are being oppressed. But everybody has to, in some sense, take care of their own and put their shoulder to the wheel without falling into self-righteousness and othering, so that ultimately, you know, there might be just a small number of, let's call them bad guys like Putin, which we're not going to necessarily rehabilitate Putin, or all of a sudden he's going to see the light as a former KGB agent who, you know, got his own narrative about Mother Russia and how it's been disregarded for centuries. And he needs to set that right before he dies. But to be aware of all of our narratives, because we all have narratives that will trip us up. And what we are looking for, in some sense, and all of us can contribute to it, is the narrative of human beings when we fall into wakefulness, when we fulfill our true potential for kindness, caring, compassion, love, and minimize all those instincts for self-centeredness, for more for me, for greed, for aversion, for othering, for finding enemies and other people who are the, you know, source of our lack of success and all that kind of stuff. That's just the mind at work when it doesn't know itself. And when you begin to recognize that, then you're not trying to shut off the mind. You're not trying to suppress your thoughts in meditation or your emotions. You just let them flow by like a river. And you be the knowing. That is what awareness is, including, just to confuse everybody if you're listening, the awareness also includes not knowing. So you don't have to know everything. You can know that you don't know, I mean, I'm talking from a place of like total not knowing. I don't know what's going to happen the next moment. I'm putting this out in some sense because of the hope and the conviction, actually, that by tuning the instrument in this way, and more of us engage in this as a way of being, not as a kind of contrived meditation practice, but as a way of being, so that how you live your life becomes the real meditation practice. I have a deep conviction that that's really going to be the only thing that in the end brings that light to shine in such a way that the darkness is really scattered.
Yeah,
and whether it's once and for all, I don't know, because the human mind, you know, the nature of humanity will always be subject to greed, hatred, and ignorance. But if we change the laws, then we can mitigate that, just like we mitigate COVID or another infectious virus. And that's where we really need wisdom instantiated in law, which is Tao, which is Dharma, which is Homo sapiens sapiens, when we actually inhabit the name that we gave ourselves, the species that is aware and is aware that it is aware.